All right, so we're going to now track Unit 3 through the body system diagram. So what we're really trying to accomplish here is addressing our last learning target, being able to use and develop a model to illustrate how levels of organization work together to maintain a multicellular organism through multiple systems. But I want you to keep in mind the grand scheme of this whole unit. We're trying to figure out what went wrong here with these marathon runners. We saw these ladies, they were running, they made it just about to the finish line, and then they just collapsed. But the announcers told us they're going to be fine. They've seen this before. So what's going on here? And we've already looked at the fact that we need ATP in order to move our bodies. And we know that in order to make ATP, we need to do aerobic respiration, ideally. So we need to be looking at getting glucose and oxygen throughout our body. And we know that when we do that, we're going to be producing carbon dioxide and water. We need to get those out of our body. And then we're going to be doing that whole process in order to get the ATP to provide the energy to allow our bodies to move. So that's a lot. Those molecules, we're going to look at how they move from one body system to another on like a micro scale, on a cellular scale, looking at how they move from one cell to another with their cell transport, but also really focus on the overall body systems that are involved here. So let's start with the system diagram. We've got carbon dioxide, oxygen, and macromolecules like glucose. So think about it maybe in terms of glucose because we're thinking about it through the lens of cellular respiration, aerobic respiration, but you would also be getting things like proteins and lipids and nucleic acids through the same process. So let's start with oxygen. We know we breathe in, we get oxygen through our nose, through our mouth. It goes down your trachea, into your bronchi, into your bronchioles, and into the alveoli. So if we take a look here, this is kind of showing that same process. This is the spot where your digestive system is going to separate from your respiratory system. So this is following the journey of your digestive system, but we're right here in that trachea. So instead of diverging here, we would go down this path, down the trachea, into those bronchi, into the bronchioles, the smaller branches. It kind of looks like an upside down tree, right, with trunk branches. Trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, down into the alveoli. And then those little alveoli at the end there, this is the important part because this is the spot of gas exchange. This is that moment where we go from the respiratory system to the circulatory system. And that's why we took a moment to draw this out on our papers. We documented the fact that with the alveoli, when you first breathe in, there's going to be high concentration of oxygen inside the alveoli. And so diffusion is going to happen. It's going to go from that high concentration to the low concentration in the capillaries so that the capillaries can then transport that oxygen throughout the body. And we'll come back to this carbon dioxide side in just a little bit. Oxygen, very small molecule. It's only 2 oxygen atoms combined together. It's a diatom. And so it's able to just do simple diffusion. It's nonpolar. It can just go across the thin layers there. And that's another important thing to note. Capillaries, super, super thin. So they're only like cell length and depth there. And same with your alveoli, also a super thin membrane. So it's going to aid in the diffusion. What else do alveoli do in terms of their structure, aiding in their function, is they increase the surface area of the lungs. So if you just had like a giant sack, if your lung was just like a giant balloon, the odds of the individual gas molecules interacting with the outside surface in order to diffuse into the circulatory system would be a lot lower than having this network of like branching ending in these alveoli, because now every single alveoli, these little tiny sacs, can interact with the circulatory system and increase that surface area, increase the amount of times, the opportunity that the gas has to meet the surface and diffuse out. So that's what's happening here. So essentially what we were drawing on the board the other day when we were drawing those structures is we were drawing this, the junction between the alveoli and the capillary. The moment when it moved from the respiratory system, left the respiratory system and the alveoli, and now as part of the capillary is officially part of the circulatory system. So if we track that further, now that it's in the capillary, what is that going to connect to? Well, the capillary is going to connect to a vein. Veins are vessels, blood vessels that connect and bring everything to the heart. The heart's kind of like a giant distribution center. So think of your capillaries as kind of side roads, your veins as highways, bringing and transporting this oxygen to the heart, this big distribution center. From the heart, it's going to leave via arteries. Think A for away. It's like the highways leaving this heart distribution center, getting into the capillaries, then wherever it is that they're being dropped off. So some of this, the oxygen, might go to this capillary here to provide oxygen to the digestive system. But we've been kind of looking at things mostly through the lens of the musculatory system, like kind of picturing what would a muscle such as a skeletal muscle, one that you could consciously control, like your biceps, your quads, things like that, how would it get the things that it needs to move? And so let's connect this capillary to this capillary. And that capillary is now going to be connected to a muscle fiber cell. So let's pause for a second and make sure we've kind of understanding what's going on here with the circulatory system. If we take a look here, we can kind of trace what we've just done, but through a different model, and it might make a little bit more sense. So what we just did was we picked up oxygen in the lungs, in the alveoli. So right here, if you were to zoom in, you'd be looking at the alveoli capillary junction. So these thin parts here that are kind of colored purple are representing the capillaries, connecting here to a pulmonary vein. That vein is going to bring it to the heart. The heart is then going to pump it out, and then it would bring it, like maybe this is in the brain, or maybe down here, this is a toe that you're trying to wiggle. So it's dropping this oxygen off at the toe, and that's exactly where we've just left off. So we've picked up oxygen, brought it to the heart so that the heart could pump it to where it needed to go in the body, is what we've been modeling here in the system diagram. And what we modeled through zooming in on that junction of respiratory and circulatory system. So what I want us to zoom in on next is the junction actually between the capillary and the muscle, because this is where it's just dropped something off and it's moving from circulatory system to the musculatory system. So to look at that, let's zoom in here. Here's a muscle with a bunch of muscle, like kind of like the tissue layer versus like the cellular layer. So if we zoom all the way in here on this muscle, you can see the capillaries. So there's a lot here. You don't need to know all of those terms. Feel free to ignore them. You can see the arteries and the veins a little bit thicker in diameter by the time you get to the capillaries down at the cellular level. So essentially here, the muscle or the capillary is dropping off the oxygen right here to this muscle cell, this muscle fiber. Because if we look at this diagram, this muscle fiber, it's one of these. So you could kind of zoom that out further. But one of those would be a muscle cell. And that's what this is showing here, the capillary kind of delivering it there. So that's a zoom in of what's happening right here. And essentially, we have just now officially dropped off oxygen. Right, O2. There we go, super official. But that's not all that's happening here. We know that the muscle is doing aerobic respiration because we've just dropped off oxygen. We know that the muscle needs ATP. We looked at the video in class of like at the smallest level, your muscles need ATP to move, multiple ATP in order to contract. The details of that you don't need to know. We were just trying to express and impress on you how important ATP is for muscular contraction, essentially. So if it's doing cellular respiration, what is it producing? It's producing carbon dioxide. And we need to get that carbon dioxide out. So this is where carbon dioxide's journey is starting. It's starting here in the muscle because that's where it's just been made in the mitochondria of the muscle cells. So we're going to track this carbon dioxide's journey out. So it's going to, through that same junction there of the capillary and the muscle cell, it's going to leave the muscle cell and diffuse into the capillary. It can diffuse because it's small and nonpolar. So this capillary now is going to connect to the veins that will carry it to the heart. Veins always go to the heart. Arteries always away from the heart. So if we kind of go back to this picture, we're now finishing this journey. We dropped off the oxygen. We're in our little muscle toe, the toe of our muscle. The muscle of our toe. There we go. Picking up carbon dioxide into the capillary. And now this capillary is going to connect to the veins that are going to bring it to the heart. Think side roads connecting to a highway, bringing it to that distribution center. And in this case, the heart is going to bring it just not to the body, but to the lungs. So it's coming from the body and pumping it to the lungs so that the lungs can then breathe out this carbon dioxide. So that's what we're tracing over here. So we're going to the heart. The heart is then going to pump it out to the arteries. Arteries connect to capillaries. Where are these capillaries now? These capillaries are the capillaries that are attached to the alveoli. So once again, we find ourselves at this junction between the circulatory system and the respiratory system. So if we take a look and zoom in, we can go back to this diagram. We've got now a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the capillary because it just picked up a bunch of carbon dioxide that it now needs to get rid of. The alveoli has a low concentration of carbon dioxide. So what's going to happen? The carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the capillary, where there's a lot of it, into the alveoli, where there's not a lot of it, low concentration. Carbon dioxide, nonpolar, small, simple diffusion. Move in through those very thin layers of capillary and alveoli. They're super thin. That's very important. Allows for this diffusion to take place. And then it's going to have an opposite journey. It's going to go through the bronchioles, to the bronchi, to the trachea, and out the mouth. And that's what we can trace on here. So carbon dioxide, we're coloring in blue here. It was in the alveoli. It's going to go up through the bronchioles, out the bronchi, and then continue trachea, out the nose/mouth. And you've breathed out carbon dioxide. And that's the journey. But there's more. Your muscle cells, way down here in your little toe, you couldn't wiggle your toe without glucose. Glucose is the most important part here probably because you can't do any kind of respiration without that glucose, whether it's anaerobic or aerobic, you need the glucose. So where are we getting that from? Well, we're getting it from our food, along with a whole bunch of other macromolecules and nutrients. So let's trace the journey of macromolecules. You're not breathing them in, you're eating through your mouth. And so instead of your trachea, it's going to go down your esophagus. So thank goodness we have this part where it can separate those two systems, because trachea versus esophagus, you don't want to get those two mixed up. Through peristalsis, the muscles are moving the food down the esophagus, not based off of gravity. It's based off of the smooth muscle contraction. And once it's in your esophagus, it's going to travel to your stomach. From your stomach, it's going to travel to your small intestines. So your small intestines are going to have villi in the inside of them. And that's really what we've been focusing on in terms of our digestive system. Inside your small intestines, it's a tube essentially, right? And you've got all of these villi on the inside. And I love this picture of it because otherwise it's really hard to picture a tube with finger-like projections on the inside of it. And if you zoom in on just one of these villi, so that's what we're doing here. We're zooming in on a villi. Each of these villi, like if you zoom in even further, actually has little microvilli. And that's really important because similarly to how the alveoli increase the surface area in the lungs, the microvilli and the villi themselves are increasing the surface area of the digestive system. Unlike the alveoli, where the capillaries are on the outside, the capillaries are actually on the inside here of the villi. So what's going to happen is you're going to get, this is a nice visual of it as well, right? You're a little simplified. Villi, or vils, singular, blood capillaries on the inside, and the inside of your small intestines here being a tube. So let's say you had a bunch of glucose, and you have a high concentration in your small intestines of glucose, low concentration in your blood capillaries. The glucose is going to diffuse through facilitated diffusion, protein channels, that GLUT protein channel, because glucose is so big, it can't just pass through on its own. It needs help. So it's going to still go from high concentration to low concentration, though. So it's not active transport. It's going in the direction it, quote unquote, wants to anthropomorphize glucose again. And it's going to go from the small intestines into the capillaries, is essentially what's happening here. So food in the small intestines into the bloodstream is what this is trying to illustrate. And once again, those super thin structure aids in the function because it increases the easiness of diffusion. So that's us zooming in right here on this junction between the villi and the capillary. And we took the time to do that because this connection between the systems is just that important. And we can also use it as a way of showing the importance of structure and function, one of our cross-cutting concepts. We can use it as case study examples of the movement, the transport of molecules, and why they move the way that they move. So now that we're in the capillary, we follow that same pathway that we were following before. We're in the bloodstream. So capillaries to veins bringing it to the heart to the artery to pump it out through the capillaries to the body to where it needs to go. And in this case, it needs to get to the muscles. So these capillaries dropping it off, and we're back here at the junction between capillaries and muscles, which is here. So in this case, artery would have connected to capillaries where they got smaller in diameter so that they could actually interact with the cells, because capillaries are thinner, so it allows for the diffusion in a way that the arteries would not. Similarly, a highway, you can't get on and off of a highway the way that you can a side road, like the kind of roads that maybe you live on or that stores are on, right? So capillaries are what you need for delivery, if you will. So here we are, we're at that junction again. Then we go back to our system diagram, and we can include the fact that we have just dropped off our macromolecules like our glucose, which is, pretend that's a C. There we go. I was going to spell out glucose, but let's do the chemical formula. C6H12O6. There we go. Not messy at all. So we've just dropped that off here. So we've dropped off glucose, we've dropped off oxygen, we picked up that carbon dioxide. We would also technically be picking up water, but because this is messy enough as it is, we're not going to trace the journey of water through the body system, but just know that that would occur. There's more to it. Of course, there's more to it. So you'll notice here the nervous system hasn't been addressed. The nervous system is in control of all of this, whether consciously or subconsciously. So your nervous system, let's try and trace that through here. I'm going to attempt to draw it through like a dotted line, I think would be the best. So it's starting in your brain. The signal is starting in your brain for you to swallow, to breathe in, to breathe out. And you can control that to an extent. Like you can consciously swallow, you can consciously breathe in, but also, especially in terms of your breathing, a lot of it is autonomic, meaning your nervous system is just taking care of it for you in the background. Like when you're sleeping, you don't have to think about breathing, your body's just doing it for you, right? Your brain is controlling that. So you have your neurons that are controlling and sending these signals. Your neurons are the cells of your nervous system. You have different types of neurons. We're going to focus on the motor neuron because that's what's going to interact with our muscles. So a motor neuron looks something like this. You've got the center of it with the nucleus, and you've got what's called these dendrites, which are kind of like the tentacles. Think dendrology, the study of trees. It kind of looks like trees again. We get a lot of tree analogies here in our body, which is kind of cool. So a signal is going to come in through these dendrites. So the signal's coming in. It's a chemical signal, like neurotransmitters. And then your neuron is going to send that down to the muscle, but it's going to send it through an electrical current, essentially. So you've got this flow of electrons, this changing of charges, which we'll look at in class. But that's sending it down this axon. So it's sending this electrical current. Then by the time it gets to the end here, this neuromuscular junction, these synapses are going to release neurotransmitters again, so a chemical signal to communicate with the muscle fiber, the muscle cell. So the neuron is sending the signal to the muscle fiber about what it needs to do, like if it needs to contract. Right? So this is that junction. If you zoom all the way in on the connection between any neuron and any muscle. And it turns out we actually have a lot of these throughout this body system. So here's a neuron. It got the signal from the brain, and it's going to send this signal, your neuron to neuron to neuron, till it gets to a muscle. And so in this case, this is a muscle, your diaphragm. It's the muscle of your respiratory system. I don't think I have a picture of it, but it would be sitting kind of underneath your lungs, contracting and relaxing and allowing for the expansion of your lungs. So without that muscle contracting, your lungs won't expand. And so that neuron is sending that signal, and it just kind of ends there. And controls that respiratory system. We also then have neurons that need to send signals to our heart, to our cardiac system, our circulatory system here. So neuron sending its signals there to the cardiac muscles. because your heart is made up of muscles. It's its own type of muscle, which is kind of cool. It's a cardiac muscle. So neurons there. We also have neurons sending signals to the smooth muscles of your digestive system. Smooth muscles make up your small intestines and your large intestines. You don't have conscious control over those the way that you do skeletal muscles. So we also have our neurons sending our signal to. It's got a long journey to go, all the way from our brain down to our toe. Dun, dun, dun. I'm going to cross over here. Oh my goodness, what a long journey to this neuron, which is connected to the muscle fiber. So let's look back at this picture once again. This junction, zooming in on the junction between your nervous system and your musculatory system. This is that neuron, and then maybe this is a muscle fiber in your toe, and you're going to wiggle your toe. So zooming in right here at this junction between the neuron and that muscle cell. In this case, it's a skeletal muscle that we're looking at. So different types of muscle, whether it's cardiac muscle, whether it's something like a smooth muscle that you don't have control over consciously, or something like a skeletal muscle, like in your toe that you can consciously control. The neurons are responsible for sending signals to control all of that. If they're your motor neurons. Alrighty, so now we've sent the signal for the muscle to contract, which is what's actually, we probably should have started with that because that's going to be what triggers all of this. The need to make the ATP, which means the need to get glucose, the need to get oxygen, which means we're making the carbon dioxide and getting rid of that. And it's all connected on a big scale with all of these body systems. So this would be like on the organism level, or the organism level is like all of this together. If we're looking at just the respiratory system, that's that organ system level. Within there, you've got individual organs like your brain, your heart, things like that, your muscle. Zoom in even further, you've got tissues. Zoom in even further, you've got cells. And then obviously we're tracking even further down, we're tracking molecules all the way through this whole system. So we're really playing with those levels of organization here. All right. I think that's all of it. That's the whole system diagram. So this is how the body, circle, we'll bring it all back here. That's all that's involved to make even like one toe wiggle. So think about it. That's happening on such an important, such a grand scale throughout your whole body if you're trying to do something like run a marathon. So that's how the body should work normally. What we have not yet fully unpacked is the last learning target here about anaerobic versus aerobic respiration, to start to try and figure out maybe what just went wrong with the women here at the finish line. Why did their body kind of fail them right there at the end? But we have unpacked how the body should work in an ideal situation.